Okay, I was about to do a whole inflation video where the hook was that Joe Manchin III was incorrect in suggesting that climate change provisions would negatively impact inflation when he shot down any climate provisions in the previous iteration of the federal spending bill. That inflation video is still coming, but I need to think of a new premise because a ball just dropped. So in this video, we're going to go into why this news is so surprising, what led up to it, what is in the act, and what it's going to take to get it passed. Hey y'all, it's Becky here from the Beccasphere, where we talk about climate news and solutions. If you want to stay up to date with the latest information, I highly suggest you hit that subscribe button below and ring the bell so you don't miss every single time I post. If you want to stay informed on extreme weather events, climate studies, climate victories, and climate fails, check out my weekday climate news podcast, The Climate Recap. Every Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday morning, I take about 10 minutes to deliver the latest international and US-based climate news. You can find The Climate Recap on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and this YouTube channel that I will link up in the cards. Also, I cover climate news weekly on a Twitch stream every Monday from 9 to 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Anyways, let's start with why this announcement of the act was such a 180. Democrats have been trying to pass climate provisions through Congress since the original Build Back Better spending bill was first created in the latter half of 2021. And it passed the House along party lines before it got stuck in the Senate, because there was no way Republicans were going to support any bill. It had to pass on party lines in the Senate as well. And West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin III blocked it. So Manchin, let's talk about him. So he has a lot of ties to the fossil fuel industry. He is by far the most fossil fuel funded congressman in office, already raking up about $6,900,000 from oil and gas companies this year alone. West Virginia is the second largest coal state in the US, and Manchin often references this when he says he needs to protect his state's economy. However, only a little over 11,400 people work in the coal industry in West Virginia as of 2020, which is almost half as many people working in that industry since Manchin took office in 2010. That means only about 6% of people in West Virginia work in the coal industry. Most people in the state actually work in healthcare and construction. Maybe it's less about the jobs and more about the business. Manchin has a coal business in his family called InterSystems Inc., where they sell a concoction of low-grade coal mixed with rock and clay, known as GOB, to the Grant Town Power Plant to burn for electricity in exchange for a cut of the money made from selling the electricity. GOB is harder and less efficient to burn than pure coal, which is why most coal-fired plants won't use it. Manchin's family, now headed by his son, has been selling GOB to Grant Town for decades, and Manchin has used his political influence to keep the plant afloat, despite the electricity it produces costing West Virginians more on their electricity bills. According to the New York Times, it costs people living in the state millions of dollars in excess electricity fees. But we know that Manchin doesn't generally care about his constituents, because if he did, he would have supported the original Build Back Better Act. The United Mine Workers of America, which has represented coal miners since the 80s, supported the act because it would prioritize transitioning coal workers to the clean energy industry. Manchin has been an honorary member of the union since 2020, but he ignored them and still blocked the act from passing. So with all this being said, I honestly thought there was no way Manchin would ever allow Congress to pass any climate or clean energy provisions. For months, I saw speculative articles about Manchin maybe supporting some climate things, but then there was nothing concrete that would ever come from it. This is particularly frustrating because the Biden administration even approved fossil fuel plants and continuously watered down the climate provisions to get Manchin to agree to something just for Manchin to say no. And then 2 weeks ago, Manchin formally said that he wouldn't support any climate provisions. So what changed? Well, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer is the guy in charge of getting Manchin to vote with the rest of the Democrat Party to get anything to get passed through Congress. After the last announcement that Manchin wouldn't agree on any climate provisions in the spending package, it was clear that Schumer had given up trying to convince Manchin. But congressional staffers wouldn't let Manchin back down. 17 staffers risked their careers by holding a sit-in in Schumer's office to protest the lack of climate action. The staffers held a poster that said, quote, "Keep negotiating, Chuck. Climate action now." Some more protested outside. When asked why they posted up in Schumer's office instead of Manchin's, one staff member said, "Because there's always going to be a sheep that strays away from the herd." It also could be because Manchin tested positive for COVID earlier that day, but I like that response. 6 staffers were arrested. This seemed to relight the fire under Schumer's butt to negotiate with Manchin. Only a day later, we saw a complete 180 with Manchin striking a deal with Schumer on an act that includes climate provisions called the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. The over 700-page bill will take $739 billion from a 15% corporate minimum tax, prescription drug savings, and added IRS enforcement to spend on healthcare, climate change, and deficit reduction strategies. The 15% corporate minimum tax will only impact some top 200 companies and is way overdue because many of these companies have avoided paying the standard 21% corporate tax rate in recent years. Some haven't even paid taxes. So closing this loophole will not only help pay for this bill, but it will also decrease the government's deficit in the long term by increasing revenue from wealthy corporations. $369 billion of the $739 billion raised will go to energy security and climate change. So let's dive into what those $1 billion will be spent on. According to the press release, the government expects investments in a wide variety of technologies like solar and wind power, batteries, hydrogen, nuclear, electric vehicles, heat pumps, and emissions reduction systems. It includes a 10-year extension of the production tax credit and the investment tax credit programs for clean energy. Towards the end of the Trump presidency, he directed those tax credits to be reduced to nothing in the next 5 years, and those credits are needed to compete with the already established and subsidized fossil fuels. More specifically, this new act would extend these credits until 2024, from which they will become a technology-neutral clean energy credit with values tied to the rate of carbon emissions reduction. Solar and wind projects were previously only allowed to access the investment tax credit and not the production tax credit, so with this act, the industry will have more support by accessing both. It also provides more incentives for wind and solar development on recently closed coal mines and plants, which could prioritize clean energy development in coal states like West Virginia. Nuclear and hydrogen projects will be able to access both production tax credits under this act too. Battery storage projects without a solar attachment and microgrid controllers will now be able to access investment tax credits for the first time. Right now, only battery storage projects connected to solar energy have access to these credits. These credits are expected to drive $30 billion of new investments along with $10 billion in investment tax credits for clean energy manufacturing facilities. Unfortunately, the bill does not offer tax credits for transmission grid investments, which is something that utilities and transmission companies have been asking for to help transition. And honestly, we really need those because there's a lot of projects right now that just can't be integrated into the grid yet.
The act does include $2 billion in funding to expand transmission lines, though.
For electric vehicles, though, the act would also allow electric vehicle manufacturing projects to access those tax credits. It would also provide an additional $20 billion in loans to build new manufacturing projects and provide $9 billion to go to the federal government, with $3 billion of that going to the U.S. Postal Service for them to buy more electric vehicles. On the consumer side, the act would extend the $7,500 tax credit for new EV purchases instead of increasing it to $12,500 as the previous bill would have. It would also introduce a new $4,000 tax credit for people to purchase used EVs if they make at or less $75,000 a year. And the bill would allocate $9 billion to consumer home energy rebate programs that would be focused on lower income consumers to help them electrify their homes. $27 billion will go to the Greenhouse Reduction Fund, meant to accelerate clean energy progress through grants, loans, and other assistance from now until 2024. This green federal bank essentially could be tapped for anything from rooftop solar to home energy efficiency retrofits to clean transportation to industry decarbonization. $8 billion of that fund will be reserved for low-income and disadvantaged communities. The bill would also permanently secure a federal trust fund to support coal workers with black lung disease, which impacts 16% of coal workers and is currently on the rise again. And West Virginia is a big location for it. And for agriculture, $20 billion of the act would go towards decarbonizing that sector.
The plan also includes a methane emissions reduction program. Methane is 84 times a more potent greenhouse gas than CO2 for the first 20 years they're in the atmosphere. So it's important to try to tackle this low-hanging greenhouse gas emission fruit. The methane emissions reduction program will assess the charge on wasteful methane emissions above threshold levels that are based on oil and gas industry's own targets, starting in 2024 at $900 per ton of methane.
The government estimates that if this act passes, it will result in a 40% emissions reduction nationwide by 2030, which is not the 50% needed to maintain our Paris Climate Agreement, but way better than if we have no act. Progressives, Biden, and most environmental groups support this act.
As soon as the act was announced, solar stocks skyrocketed.
However, fossil fuel companies like ExxonMobil also like this act, which leads me into the darker side of it. The bill would require the Interior Department to hold lease sales for oil and gas exploration in the Gulf of Mexico and the Cook Inlet of Alaska. It also requires the department to continue to hold auctions for fossil fuel leases if it plans to approve new wind and solar projects on federal lands. It expands tax credits to carbon capture and storage technology, which has mostly been a way to allow oil and gas plants to stick around for longer because they might someday be carbon neutral. For the record, no technology exists that can offset a fossil fuel plant's emissions.
For the record, carbon capture and storage is an important technology because we've waited so long to decarbonize, and so I'm not completely dissing the technology or the fact that it's receiving subsidies. I only have an issue when it allows for the elongation of the lifespan of fossil fuel power plants. I don't think that it should necessarily be tested to only take up CO2 from fossil fuel power plants because that shouldn't be its main focus. Its main focus, if anything, would be to help decarbonize harder to decarbonize sectors instead of spaces that can be decarbonized through things like wind and solar. So I just wanted to clarify that because it sounded like I completely hate all form of carbon capture, which is not true. I just think that fossil fuel companies and fossil fuel supporters like carbon capture for a very disingenuous reason. And I think the strategic change of the credits to count for any type of technology that decreases its emissions might include fossil fuel companies who at least pretend to decrease their emissions sufficiently through carbon capture and storage. Also, there was a recent study that came out that showed that global carbon capture and storage might be overestimating how much it captures each year by 19 to 30%. So take that with what you will.
Manchin also secured a promise from lead Democrats to vote on a separate measure to speed up the process of issuing permits for energy infrastructure. This could potentially smooth the way for projects like a natural gas pipeline in West Virginia. This bill basically ensures Biden breaks his promise to not allow any oil or gas lease sales on public lands or waters. But I guess this is the closest thing a divided and fossil fuel addicted United States can get to reducing emissions. I wonder how true Congress's emissions reduction projection can be if more oil and gas projects get locked in.
Luckily for us, the Rotem Group, which I've covered on this channel before, released a report detailing how they see this act impacting the country's emissions. They found that despite there being benefits to fossil fuels in the act, the emissions projection Congress estimated can still be realized. The group determined this bill will reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 31 to 44% by 2030 if passed. One of the reasons why the potential for new fossil fuel projects won't derail emissions reductions targets is because the act includes higher royalty rates, which is expected to provide downward pressure on CO2 emissions.
Regardless, this bill would still be the biggest federal climate bill in U.S. history, and we still need it to pass because clean energy growth in this country has stalled due to economic and political instability.
Moody's Analytics determines that this bill will do as its name suggests and bring down inflation. When it specifically comes to climate provisions, the act will increase the GDP by 0.1% by 2030 compared to if no climate provisions were in the bill. The long-term impacts of climate action adds up over time, with it adding 0.6% to the GDP by 2050 and 2.7% to the GDP by 2100.
So let's take a look at what is needed for it to pass. It will still need the support from all Democrats in the House and the Senate to pass, because no Republicans are going to support this bill. The Democrat in the House to watch for is New Jersey Representative Josh Gottheimer, who wanted a full state and local tax, or SALT, deduction to be added back into the bill. This deduction was omitted from this version because most Democrats say that the deduction only benefits homeowners and more affluent Americans. While other Democrats who do support the deduction have still signaled support for the Inflation Reduction Act, Gottheimer has kept his cards close to his chest, making him a wild card. Then in the Senate, Arizona Senator Kyrsten Sinema's vote is still up in the air too. She's the second most difficult Democrat behind Manchin, having also halted congressional progress with Manchin many times. Sinema has given no indication which way she'd vote on this act, but she has previously opposed anything that closes the tax loophole. A positive is that Manchin doesn't seem like he will back out this time. He actually appears quite passionate about this bill, which makes sense, because honestly, he won. He has already done several interviews supporting it, including on places like Fox News. He's been wanting to close the corporate tax loophole for a while, and he insists that the bill won't make inflation worse. Democrats are going to need to move this bill through this week if it's going to get passed before Congress takes a summer recess on August 5th. COVID isn't helping the timeline, as multiple lawmakers have contracted the virus over the last 2 weeks. Biden caught it for a second time in a row already. So my fingers and toes are crossed for this whole week. Let me know what you think of this bill. Do you think it will pass? Will it reduce emissions as much as the press release claims? And will it help or hurt inflation? I would love to hear all your thoughts in the comments section below. Until next time, remember to talk about the climate crisis every single day and to support your local news organizations. A big shout out to the people on Patreon who help me pay for my equipment and the many news subscriptions that make these videos possible. A special shout out to the climate confident and courageous David H., Norman Anal, Greg H., Paul B., Phil Plasma, and Dan Morton. I greatly appreciate your support. If you would like to monetarily support the work I do, check out the Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links in the description box below for reoccurring or one-time payments. Bye for now.